Coronavirus damage ripples across the U.S. economy, but is the worst yet to come? Expert analysis on this edition of Politicking. Welcome to Politicking. I'm Larry King. Confirmed cases of the coronavirus in the United States are on the rise, and news of that has helped lead to down days on the stock market and in some sectors of the United States economy, especially travel. But is the worst yet to come? That's where we lead off the discussion with Michael Szanto, economist, stock market analyst, and foreign policy commentator, and he joins us from Miami. Is the worst yet to come, Michael?
Very possibly, unfortunately, because it looks like we're at the beginning part of a major pandemic, and it's only really begun to spread in the United States.
How vulnerable, basically, why is the U.S. economy so 2,000 down? Why is it so vulnerable to the United States economy?
Well, let me say that fundamentally going into this, the United States economy was in many ways very strong. It's a very diversified, very robust economy. But on the other hand, there was a certain element of complacency on the part of the stock market. Valuations were stretched or overvalued, so I think that creates a little bit of a challenge. But, you know, this looks like, unfortunately, the biggest pandemic in a century, the most dangerous pandemic we faced in a century since the Spanish flu pandemic. And the efforts to contain it directly impact all kinds of economic activity, from air travel to cruises, obviously, to simply getting to work. People are now working from home, so they're not going to the places where they'd ordinarily go for lunch. You know, we see South by Southwest in Austin, Texas canceled. We see Ultra Music Festival already canceled in Miami. So we're facing a potential major disruption in our economic activity over the next few months.
How it affects all of us, let me ask Michael Szanto. Would you fly from Miami to Chicago today on a commercial airliner?
I would, but you know, one of the things that you need to consider is the potential role that you play in spreading it to, I'm not particularly at risk, but if you catch it and become infectious, contagious, you have to consider the effect that it would have on your family, anyone who's immunocompromised or elderly, and the possibility of it spreading. But you know, the vast majority of the population isn't horribly threatened by the virus, and you know, that is at least a minor half blessing, because Spanish flu pandemic actually did kill a lot of young adults. This one generally does not. It's the elderly that's most exposed. So yes, I would fly, but it's like a catch-22. Our efforts to contain the virus will largely actually slow our economy and be kind of a constraining force in spending and business activity overall.
Has it hit China the worst?
You know, from the reports that we're getting from China, it is perhaps actually already peaked in China, but China obviously is not a democracy. It's very authoritarian in many levels, so they've been able to impose pretty serious quarantines. We're seeing similar efforts now being done in Italy that are less effective. But it is almost amazing that the spread of this virus in China seems to have slowed quite a bit. But we've already faced major impacts on the global supply chain, because obviously China is very, very important in many industries in terms of its role in the supply chain.
Okay, another key question. Do you expect a recession this year?
It is unfortunately very, very likely, because we're facing a major supply and demand shock. What that means is our ability globally to produce goods has been really, really hit, and our ability to the demand, the desire to go to movie theaters or plays or travel has been greatly diminished. So both on the demand side and supply side, there's a major shock. So we haven't seen a potential for a recession like that in many decades. At the same time, many central banks, including the central bank, have already reached very, very, very low, near zero interest rates. So they don't really have much ammunition on the part of monetary policy. So that's another problem. But because we're also facing, as I said before, a shock to supply, it can make it even tougher because prices could actually go up. We can't assume that we will only face the disinflation that we faced in the last couple of decades, because supply constraints shortages can actually lead to prices rising. And that could make the job of the central banks around the world and the Federal Reserve even more complicated, even more challenging in this case.
Did you agree with the cut last week and another one coming, they say, March 18th?
Yes, I mean, the Federal Reserve has to try to play its role, but in this case, it might be more limited. By making it a more emergency action, it might have shaken the markets. But by looking at how much the stock market has dropped today, basically market falls were probably inevitable, because at this point in time, efforts to stop this virus or slow this virus are going to be very, very destabilizing, disrupting to our economic activities at this point. But the talk now of actually expanding to fiscal policy makes sense, so that there's not a shortage of money circulating. Monetary policy plays part of that role, but the Federal Reserve is somewhat tapped out at this point. So Congress can step up and help small businesses and other businesses, even cruise companies that have their businesses disrupted, so that we don't compound it with lots of employees being laid off or businesses directly affected by efforts to curtail this virus, not being able to pay their bills and snowballing. So, and today we're starting to see some hints of at least a minor liquidity and financial issues, that it's moving into basically the repo markets and other purely financial markets, so that we could face a credit crunch. So that the Fed can partly address with non-conventional policies, but Congress may have to step up and make sure, for example, people don't feel pressured to go to work if they're sick, but also if Congress helps through targeted fiscal policies of making sure that employees continue to get their wages, the employees, the consumers in the end, will continue to be able to hopefully spend and help lessen the potential impact of a potential recession, or lessen the severity of a potential recession.
I asked you, Michael, you said you would certainly fly from Miami to Chicago. Would you take a cruise ship to the Bahamas?
Oy. I mean, we're seeing ships kind of quarantined on occasion. I think that's going to lessen. I mean, assuming that the virus is at its worst right now, at some point there will be so much community spread of this virus that countries, including the United States, will likely not be so aggressive in quarantining the ships the way that they are, where people have to be quarantined at least for 14 days if a few people are on the cruise that are positive. That might end. So that is a ray of hope. I can't guarantee it, but basically we had a few ships where maybe just one patient started to unintentionally infect a bunch of people, and it became a petri dish for this coronavirus. But as we see more and more community spread within, for example, the United States and many other countries, I would anticipate the possibility that the threat of ships being quarantined is going to lessen, because it's going to be already in the United States and Europe and in East Asia, all over the place anyway, so that there will be less aggressive, which has put people on those affected ships through hell. So the risk of that could greatly diminish, as long as, God forbid, we don't, have an outbreak of something else, which is very, very unlikely. So, but that's going to be something that's going to be talked about once we get through this pandemic or this outbreak. But you've got to feel for the cruise industry right now. I think that their market valuations have already dropped, I believe, 50%, but it could get worse, because even once the spread of this virus stops, there's a good chance that this would. So you asked me if I would take a cruise. At some point, yes, I'd consider it, but I also imagine that, well, right now, there's still a risk of getting quarantined, frankly.
How do you think the federal government's been handling this?
We have seen for the whole duration of the Trump administration poor handling of information and misleading information that has continued at this point. This is, as I said, the worst pandemic, the most dangerous pandemic that we've seen in a century. So it's a very challenging situation. I think in many ways the CDC and even FDA and other government agencies have done a good job. So I just think that communications, you have to be open with American people. You have to be giving good, reliable information, not shake the American public's confidence more than necessary. But I think this could potentially challenge, by the way, our medical system. And I think once we get through this, at least hopefully it'll allow us to be more prepared for the next outbreak of something, which is inevitable, but hopefully the next one is contained and doesn't become a pandemic. But I don't really think, that maybe if China had acted a little bit quicker, that it could have been contained at that point, perhaps. But we may face in the future viruses that are more contagious and even, unfortunately, deadlier. So this is also, I think, good practice so that if something else pops up 10, 20 years from now, we'll hopefully be more prepared. From the federal government to hospitals to everyone, to cruise lines, airlines, everyone.
What manufacturers that are doing well, I guess, would be those that make face masks and hand sanitizers. What industry, other than obviously the travel industry, is getting hit the hardest by this?
That's interesting. Well, potentially it's going to be widespread. That's why we're seeing stock market losses that are just across the board. I think that almost no companies are going down 10%, at least 10% at this point. And a lot of companies are going down at least 20%. We're also seeing now, of course, a oil pricing war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which is hitting U.S. energy stocks really, really hard, especially of fracking companies, which may be a little bit intentional because that's another competitor. So we see the blessing is we're going to get very, very low oil prices. On the flip side, as we start to get through and if we get out of this crisis where the virus ultimately subsides, I think if it turns out kind of bad, one of the assessments is going to be that we need to invest even more in our emergency rooms throughout the country and ICUs for preparedness for things, particularly like viral outbreaks. So, but it's very systemic. Like right now, we're seeing even elements of at least a minor financial crisis where the Fed actually has to step in and actually start to back financial institutions in the United States and globally and make sure that there's adequate dollar supply globally.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very, very welcome.
Michael Szanto, economist, stock market analyst, and a good guest. More politicking right after the break.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
I'm a journalist. It's all I know, being a truth teller. People say I make them uncomfortable. Good. News is like a jackhammer. You drill down until you find the truth. The News with Rick Sanchez, because it's time to do news again and question more.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
Welcome back to Politicking. As cases of COVID-19 increase in the U.S., the federal government seems to be struggling with a unified response to the epidemic. What impact will this have on the Trump administration's handling of the crisis in the 2020 race. For this, we turn to our political panel. They are Michael Trujillo, Democratic political strategist. He joins us here in studio. And in New York City, Jen Kearns, GOP strategist, former spokesperson for the California Republican Party. How has President Trump handled this, Michael?
Well, I think he's trying to tweet his way out of it when he should be putting a vaccine together. And that's the unfortunate thing. You know, we want transparency. We want to know what's going on with the CDC, how many test kits are out there, who's being tested, and whether or not there's going to be a vaccine on market relatively soon and hopefully free.
Jen?
Well, I think the vaccine, you know, health officials of both parties have said that it takes about 18 months for a vaccine to hit the market on this. But look, it might surprise you here, Larry. I actually don't give President Trump that high of a grade for his response on coronavirus. I think that the president has been busy sort of doing damage control. He's very hesitant to talk about how many cases there are in the United States of America. He's sort of trying to downplay this as if it's no big deal, and actually to a great proportion of the population, those that are 60 years old and above, of the boomer generation, of which is the most populous generation there is, and also those who have underlying health conditions, it's actually quite serious and could result in death. And so I always look at things from a political PR standpoint, not just because it's an election year, but because I've served in administrations, I've served in emergency response capacities. I was spokesperson for the California wildfires. I was an assistant deputy insurance commissioner for the state of California dealing with health issues. And I have to tell you, Larry, you have to level with people when it comes to a public health crisis. And I don't believe that the administration is fully doing that at this point. I think the administration needs to put together very quickly, as in tomorrow, a PR response team that comes directly out of the West Wing and reports directly to either Vice President Mike Pence or President Trump himself, that is dealing with the public information output on everything related to the coronavirus to inform the American people.
Michael, I've known Jen for years, interviewed her many times. It's the first time she has ever, I think, a half a criticism toward a Republican. But she's on the mark. Trump seems hesitant, you know, when he does a press conference or he has notes. I don't know where he stands on this.
Well, I think this is the first issue that he can't bully his way out of. I mean, usually he has a human opponent on the other side, whether it's a senator or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. He's able to really sort of go after a human. Here you have a virus that doesn't care about his tweets, doesn't care about his derelict in leadership. And really this virus is going to have an impact. And if we really want to get in front of it and contain it to the best of our ability, he's going to have to listen to the experts and take a back seat.
What effect on the election?
That's an excellent question. I think right now we don't know the answer to that. I think what you want it to do is you want it to be a temporary blip. We want to get this under control. I would hope it has no impact on the election. We want to sort of just get folks back in and back to work and back to school. But if it does, this is not a positive thing for President Trump if we're still talking about this in November.
Jen, what do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of runway between now and the November election. I think he has plenty of time to recover if he puts into place a very informative public outreach program, as I just described. Look, I think the better part of the coronavirus wraps up end of April, 1st of May. But what may last longer than that will be the impact to the airlines, the travel industry, the economy, and the markets. And President Trump, as you know, has hinged his reelection on the markets. And so I can already hear in my head some of those TV campaign ads for the fall talking about the markets and how President Trump bragged about those at so many of these rallies. And the problem is, if you want to ride the markets when they go up, you also own them when they come down. And so I think the administration and the campaign have to be planning for that. But there's plenty of time for him to recover, but he has to do the right thing. He has to face this head on.
All right, Michael, let's look at this election race. Is it Biden's to win?
It's Biden's to win. Joe Biden is going to be our nominee, and he's going to take it to President Trump. He's going to remind America what it was like during the Obama-Biden years, where you had steady leadership, a steady hand at the wheel, and folks being able to trust what their commander-in-chief says on a daily basis. And probably, I assume if Mr. Biden becomes president, he probably won't be tweeting as much, and that's a good thing.
Jen, going back to that famous phone call, is Trump's biggest worry Biden?
Well, not anymore. I think we've seen enough of Joe Biden on the campaign trail now that this may be a different Joe Biden than President Trump may have known before. Look, Joe Biden doesn't know which state he's in, depending on which day it is, and that comes from the left-wing media that's been out there on the campaign trail with him. I noticed today they have Uncle Joe back on teleprompter. I think that is probably a wise move. You got to keep him very scripted when he's on stage, and then when he's off stage milling through the crowds, you got to let that Uncle Joe kind of relaxed Joe Biden personality prevail. But look, I think the Democratic nomination is Joe Biden's to win. But I am looking at the markets today, and I have to think there are a few Democrats wishing that Mike Bloomberg hadn't gotten out of the race so early and that the Democrats hadn't consolidated behind Joe Biden so early. It would be very interesting to have seen a three-way debate this coming Sunday between Biden, Bernie, and Bloomberg. Given the situation in the markets, that would have been quite interesting to see.
We have to give Bernie Sanders some credit, don't we, Michael? I mean, he has forged himself from Vermont into a major national figure.
Absolutely. I think what Senator Sanders has done is remarkable. I think he deserves credit for moving our party towards the next generation of ideas and where our party is going to be eventually. So absolutely, I don't have anything negative to say about Senator Sanders in terms of what he's done for moving our Democratic Party in the last 5 years.
And Jen, Trump has taken such control of your party that it's hard to think of who's next in line. I know the vice president seems obvious, but who's a major Republican do you see following Trump?
Well, we have a lot of rising stars. We have Nikki Haley that could certainly be in the running in 2024. I do think that Donald Trump Jr. wants to be in the running for 2024. I think his debate challenge to Hunter Biden, I think, sort of hints at that, and I've heard that through the Republican grapevine. But we have a lot of rising stars. You look at Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Joni Ernst, a lot of folks across the country that have great profiles in the Congress. And you also have people like Kevin McCarthy, who's been a very strong GOP leader. He was able to hold the GOP together in the House and not allow one single vote to go toward impeachment. So we have a lot of rising stars on the GOP side.
What about the vice president?
I'm not sure that he wants the position. I really don't. I think Mike Pence is one of those utility players that's happy in the role that he's in currently. And I think after 8 years of being President Trump's deputy, I think Mike Pence will want to take a nice long vacation.
Michael, what part will Obama play in the next election?
Well, I think he's going to play a massive part. This is the person, our nominee looks like it's going to be Vice President Joe Biden, and this was the first appointment President Biden made when he was the nominee for our party. His first selection was Joe Biden.
Obama.
Right, and so I think President Obama is going to be out there pushing his deputy forward, and it's going to be an exciting race. I think Obama, the great thing about President Obama, he could be in Florida with 20,000 people, while Vice President Joe Biden, our nominee, is in Ohio with 10,000 people, and everyone else amongst the stars, Mayor Pete, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Harris, sort of in all these states, and making sure we push our nominee over the edge to beat Donald Trump.
The most popular figure on the other side.
If I may
is
add to that, Larry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people don't know this, but a very high-placed source did tell me a few days ago, and I did report this at the time, that it was none other than President Barack Obama who actually placed the phone call, the critical phone call, to Mayor Pete Buttigieg and asked him to withdraw from the race and get behind Joe Biden. And Obama was really hoping to sort of keep his powder dry in case he was needed at the DNC convention for a contested convention. But the situation was looking so desperate in their attempt to try to stop Bernie that it was President Obama who actually made that call and began that contagion for Joe Biden. So Obama is certainly putting his finger on the scale, I think a little earlier than he had intended to. But he is involved, make no mistake about it.
All right, give me an analysis for both of you. Michael, you first. A Biden-Trump race.
I think I think we're going to be calling him President Joe Biden. That's my analysis. I think we're going to win the Electoral College.
So he has to win those key industrial states.
I think he has to win Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and we have Tammy Baldwin, we have Mayor Whitmer, and we have we have strong folks there that are going to be able to push us over the top, and Amy Klobuchar. So we have 3 women that are going to be pushing Joe Biden across the Electoral College line to be our next president.
Jen, how do you see the race?
Boy, I think the first debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is going to be ratings gold. And I say that having been a presidential debate writer for the first debate between Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump. So that's saying a lot. But boy, Joe Biden really would have to get extremely disciplined as a candidate before he heads off against President Trump. Otherwise, I think President Trump eats his lunch, not only at the debates, but also at the polling places come November.
Thank you both very much. Michael and Jen, thanks much. So good to have you with us today. And thank you, audience, for joining us on this edition of Politicking. Remember, you can join the conversation on my Facebook page or tweet me at King's Things. And don't forget to use the Politicking hashtag. And that's all for this edition of Politicking.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.
I'm a journalist. It's all I know, being a truth teller. People say I make them uncomfortable. Good. News is like a jackhammer. You drill down until you find the truth. The News with Rick Sanchez, because it's time to do news again and question more.
Aeroflot, Russian Airlines.